My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 32 years old, and I thought I knew everything about my family until 3 weeks ago when I found the letter that changed everything. It was tucked behind a loose floorboard in my grandmother's attic, yellowed with age and sealed with trembling hands decades ago. The moment I broke that wax seal, my entire world crumbled like ancient paper. I'd been cleaning out Grandma Rosa's house after her funeral, going through boxes of memories and old photographs, when I accidentally stepped on a creaky board. Something about the sound felt wrong, hollow. When I pried it up, there it was, a small wooden box containing documents that would shatter every truth I'd ever believed about my family. The letter was addressed to me, written in my grandmother's careful script, for Sarah, when I'm no longer here to explain. My hands shook as I unfolded it. The first line made my blood run cold. Your mother didn't die in a car accident, sweetheart. She was murdered, and I know who did it. 27 years. 27 years I'd lived believing my mother died when I was 5 in a tragic collision on Highway 9. 27 years of visiting her grave, leaving flowers, talking to a headstone that I now realized was nothing but an elaborate lie. The cemetery visits, the anniversary grief, the way my father would get that distant look in his eyes every December 15th, it all suddenly made terrible sense. But it was the next paragraph that truly destroyed me. Your father killed her, Sarah. I have proof. I've kept it all these years, waiting for the right time to tell you. That time never came, and now I'm dying with this burden. The evidence is in the red shoebox under my bed. Use it wisely. I remember dropping the letter, my vision blurring with tears and disbelief. This had to be some cruel joke, some mistake. My father raised me alone after Mom's accident. He was the one who held me when I cried, who taught me to ride a bike, who walked me down the aisle at my wedding just 2 years ago. He couldn't be a killer. He couldn't have murdered the woman I'd spent my entire life mourning. But even as I tried to dismiss it, memories began surfacing like bubbles from the depths of a dark pond. The way Dad would change the subject whenever I asked about Mom. How he destroyed all her personal belongings, claiming it was too painful to keep them. The strange phone calls he'd sometimes get late at night, conversations conducted in hushed, urgent whispers. I'd always attributed these things to grief, to a man trying to protect his daughter from painful memories. Now I wondered if he was protecting himself from something far worse. The red shoebox was exactly where Grandma Rose said it would be, dusty and worn, sitting like a time bomb under her bed. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled it out, knowing that whatever was inside would change everything forever. There's a moment before you open Pandora's box when you can still choose ignorance, still live in the comfortable lie. I almost put it back. But I couldn't. I had to know. Inside were photographs that made my stomach lurch. Pictures of my mother, but not the smiling family portraits I'd grown up seeing. These showed her with bruises on her arms, a black eye barely concealed with makeup, a split lip that she was trying to hide behind a forced smile. There had to be dozens of them, taken over what looked like months or years, documenting a pattern of abuse I never knew existed. Beneath the photos were hospital records. Emergency room visits, 4 falls downstairs, walking into doors, slipping in the shower. The dates painted a timeline of escalating violence that made me physically sick. How had no one noticed? How had my 5-year-old self remained oblivious to the fact that my father was systematically destroying the woman who gave birth to me? But it was the final item that provided the smoking gun, a cassette tape labeled December 14th in my grandmother's handwriting. I found an old player in her closet and with trembling fingers, pressed play. My mother's voice filled the room, weak and frightened. "Rose, I can't take this anymore. He said if I try to leave, he'll kill me. He means it this time. Last night he put his hands around my throat and I couldn't breathe. I thought I was going to die right there in front of Sarah." Then my grandmother's voice, urging her to call the police. "Emma, you have to report this. You have to think about Sarah's safety too." "You don't understand," my mother whispered. "He's a cop, Rose. Half the force owes him favors. Who's going to believe me? Who's going to protect us if I speak up? He has friends everywhere." The tape continued for 20 more minutes, my mother detailing years of abuse, manipulation, and threats. She spoke of plans to disappear, to take me and run somewhere he'd never find us. She talked about gathering evidence, about building a case that even his police connections couldn't cover up. The recording ended with her saying, "If something happens to me, Rose, promise you'll keep this safe. Promise you'll make sure Sarah knows the truth someday. Don't let him rewrite history. Don't let him play the grieving widower when he's the one who destroyed our family." I sat in that dusty attic, sobbing for the mother I never really knew, for the woman who died trying to protect me from a monster I'd called Daddy for 32 years. The days following my discovery passed in a haze of disbelief and growing rage. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything except the horrible truth burning inside me like acid. My husband Mark noticed something was wrong, but how could I explain that everything about my life had been built on a foundation of lies and murder? I kept staring at my father during our usual Sunday dinner, searching his familiar face for signs of the killer my grandmother had revealed. He looked the same as always: distinguished silver hair, laugh lines around his eyes, the gentle smile that had comforted me through scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks. But now I noticed things I'd never seen before. The way his jaw tensed when Mark mentioned a crime documentary we'd watched. How his hands, those same hands that had braided my hair and taught me to drive, would clench slightly whenever the conversation touched on domestic violence cases he'd worked. Because yes, he'd continued his police career after Mom's death, eventually becoming chief of detectives. The irony was suffocating. The man who'd murdered my mother had spent decades putting other criminals behind bars, playing the role of protector and servant of justice. How many times had he sat across from grieving families, offering condolences and promising to find their loved ones' killers, all while knowing he was exactly the type of monster they were hunting? I started researching the official reports from December 15, 1996. The accident report painted a clear picture. Emma Mitchell lost control of her vehicle on a slick stretch of Highway 9 during a snowstorm, crashed into a tree, and died on impact. The investigating officers noted no signs of foul play, no evidence to suggest anything other than tragic circumstances. The report was signed by Detective William Chen and reviewed by Sergeant James Mitchell, my father. My father had investigated his own wife's death. He'd controlled the narrative from the very beginning, ensuring that no one looked too closely at the evidence, that no awkward questions were asked. It was the perfect crime, committed by someone who knew exactly how to cover his tracks. But as I dug deeper, I found cracks in his perfect facade. The tow truck driver who'd retrieved Mom's car had noted unusual damage patterns that weren't consistent with hitting a tree head-on. A nurse at the morgue had mentioned bruising on the victim's neck that seemed fresh, unrelated to the crash injuries. These details had been dismissed or explained away, buried in supplemental reports that no one bothered to read. My grandmother had been right. This wasn't an accident. It was murder, carefully planned and expertly concealed by a man who'd sworn an oath to protect and serve. I became obsessed with building an airtight case against my father. Every free moment was spent poring over the evidence, consulting with lawyers, researching cold case procedures. I learned that there's no statute of limitations on murder, that even after 27 years, justice could still be served if I could prove what really happened that snowy December night. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal. Sitting across from him at family dinners, listening to his stories about work, watching him play with my 2-year-old nephew, all while knowing what he'd done. The way he'd kiss my forehead when saying goodbye made my skin crawl. This man had stolen my mother from me, had robbed me of the relationship we should have had, and then spent 3 decades playing the role of devoted single father. I hired a private investigator named David Torres, a former cop who specialized in cold cases. When I showed him the evidence, his expression grew increasingly grim. "This is substantial," he said, studying the photographs and hospital records. "But proving murder after all this time, especially when the suspect controlled the initial investigation, that's going to be challenging." David began tracking down people who'd been involved in the original case. The tow truck driver had died years ago, but his son remembered him talking about that strange accident, how the damage didn't make sense. The morgue nurse was still alive, living in Arizona now, and she remembered the case clearly. "Those bruises haunted me," she told David over the phone. "I tried to bring it up with the detective, but he said it was probably from the steering wheel impact. I knew he was wrong, but he was the expert, you know?" We found other pieces too. A neighbor who remembered hearing screaming from our house the night before Mom died, but was too scared to call the police because my father was the police. A mechanic who'd worked on Mom's car just days before the accident, swearing that her brakes were in perfect condition. Small details that painted a larger picture of premeditation and cover-up. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. David discovered that my father had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on my mother just 6 months before her death. $250,000, with him as the sole beneficiary. When questioned about it at the time, he'd claimed it was just responsible financial planning for a young family. Now it looked like something much more sinister, a man planning to profit from his wife's murder. The weight of carrying this knowledge was crushing me. I'd lost 15 pounds, developed chronic insomnia, and started having panic attacks whenever I saw police cars. Mark was growing increasingly concerned, begging me to tell him what was wrong, but I couldn't drag him into this nightmare. Not yet. 3 weeks into my investigation, I made a mistake that nearly cost me everything. I'd been so careful, so methodical in gathering evidence, but grief and rage made me sloppy. I confronted Mrs. Henderson, our elderly neighbor who'd witnessed the screaming match between my parents the night before Mom died. She was hesitant at first, claiming her memory wasn't what it used to be, but eventually the truth came pouring out. "I heard her crying," she whispered, glancing around nervously even though we were sitting in her living room. "She was begging him not to hurt her anymore." Then there was this awful sound, like something being thrown against the wall, and everything went quiet. Mrs. Henderson had called 911 that night, but when the patrol car arrived, my father answered the door in his detective's badge, explaining that there'd been a misunderstanding, that his wife had fallen during an argument but was fine now. The responding officers took his word for it and left without even speaking to my mother. "I should have insisted they check on her," Mrs. Henderson said, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "I should have done more. Maybe if I had." But my father had been watching. Somehow, he'd learned about my visits to the neighbors, my meetings with the private investigator, my trips to the courthouse to review old records. I came home that evening to find him sitting in my living room, chatting casually with Mark about a baseball game. "Sarah, sweetheart," he said with that familiar smile that now made my blood run cold. "Mark was just telling me you've been under a lot of stress lately. Working too hard, not sleeping well. That's not healthy for a young woman." The warning was subtle but unmistakable. He knew what I was doing, and he was letting me know that he knew. The same man who'd murdered my mother was now sitting in my home, threatening me with the same casual demeanor he'd used to cover up his crimes for nearly 3 decades. After he left, Mark confronted me. "What's going on, Sarah? And don't tell me it's nothing. You've been acting strange for weeks, and now your father's asking weird questions about your activities. Are you having an affair? Are you in some kind of trouble?" I almost broke down and told him everything right then. But I couldn't risk it. If my father was willing to kill once to protect his secrets, what would he do to Mark, to me, to anyone who threatened to expose him? That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd inherited my mother's fate. Would I become another accident statistic, another tragic story about a young woman who died too soon? The next morning brought a phone call that made my blood freeze. It was David Torres, my private investigator, and his voice was tight with concern. "Sarah, we have a problem. Someone broke into my office last night. They didn't take any equipment or cash, but all the files related to your case are gone. Every photograph, every document, every interview transcript." My hands shook as I gripped the phone. "What about backup copies?" "I kept digital copies on an encrypted drive, but that's missing too." Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for. This was professional, Sarah. And I have a feeling I know who's behind it. The message was clear. My father wasn't just aware of my investigation, he was actively sabotaging it. Just like he'd controlled the narrative 27 years ago, he was using his connections and expertise to stay ahead of me now. But this time, I had an advantage he didn't know about. I'd made my own copies of everything, hidden in a safety deposit box across town. David advised me to go to the FBI, to take the case to someone outside my father's sphere of influence. "Local cops might be compromised," he explained. "Your father's been on the force for over 30 years. He's got friends everywhere, people who owe him favors. But federal agents don't have those same loyalties." I spent the afternoon researching which FBI office to contact, which agents specialized in cold case murders. But every time I picked up the phone to make the call, I hesitated. Once I made this official, there would be no going back. My father would be arrested, probably convicted, and I'd lose the only parent I'd ever really known, even if he was a monster. The internal conflict was tearing me apart. Part of me still loved the man who'd raised me, who'd been present for every important moment of my life. Another part of me was screaming for justice for my mother, for the woman who'd died trying to protect me from the truth I was now facing. That evening, as I sat in my car outside the FBI field office, gathering courage to walk inside, my phone rang. It was my father. "Hello, sweetheart. I was thinking we should have dinner tomorrow night, just the two of us. There are some things we need to discuss about your mother, about the past. I think it's time you knew the whole truth." The irony was suffocating. After 27 years of lies, he was finally ready to tell me the truth, but only because I'd forced his hand. only because he knew I'd uncovered his secrets and was closing in on him. What truth, Dad? I asked, my voice barely steady. Meet me at Rossini's tomorrow at 7. Come alone, Sarah. This conversation is long overdue. I spent that entire sleepless night wondering if I was walking into a trap. Was my father planning to silence me the same way he'd silenced my mother? Or was this genuinely his attempt to finally come clean about what happened that December night 27 years ago? I made arrangements just in case. I left a sealed envelope with Mark, with instructions to open it if anything happened to me. Inside was a letter explaining everything I'd discovered, along with the location of the safety deposit box containing all the evidence. I also called David Torres and told him about the dinner, asking him to contact the police if he didn't hear from me by midnight. Rossini's was our special place, the Italian restaurant where Dad had taken me for birthday dinners since I was 6 years old. The irony of having this confrontation in a place filled with happy memories wasn't lost on me. I arrived early, choosing a table near the back where we could talk privately, and waited. He walked in at exactly 7 o'clock, looking older than I'd ever seen him. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by the shuffle of a man carrying an enormous burden. When he sat down across from me, I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of decades of secrets finally taking their toll. "You look just like her," he said quietly, studying my face. "Every year, you look more and more like Emma. Sometimes it takes my breath away." We ordered mechanically, neither of us really interested in food. Then he began to speak, and the words that came out were nothing like what I'd expected to hear. "Your mother was going to leave me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She'd been planning it for months, maybe longer. She was going to take you and disappear, and I would never have seen either of you again." I wanted to interrupt, to tell him I knew about the abuse, about the hospital visits and the documented violence. But something in his tone made me stay silent and listen. "I loved her more than life itself, Sarah. I know that probably sounds impossible to believe now, but it's true. Emma was everything to me. When I realized she was going to leave, when I found the hidden suitcase and the bus tickets, I lost my mind. I couldn't imagine living without her, without you." His hands were shaking as he reached for his water glass. "That last night, we fought. She told me she'd rather die than spend one more day in our house. She said she'd rather you grow up without a father than grow up watching him destroy her piece by piece." The restaurant noise faded into background as his confession continued. "I never meant for it to happen the way it did," he continued, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I grabbed her arm, trying to stop her from leaving, and she pulled away so hard she fell. Hit her head on the corner of the coffee table. There was so much blood, Sarah. So much blood." I sat frozen, watching this man I'd called father my entire life finally reveal the truth about the night that destroyed our family. But his version didn't match what I'd discovered in my grandmother's evidence. She was unconscious, but she was breathing. I should have called an ambulance immediately, but I panicked. All I could think about was losing everything: my career, my reputation, you. So I made a terrible decision. I put her in the car and drove out to Highway 9, thinking I could make it look like an accident. My stomach churned as he described staging the scene, positioning her body in the driver's seat, sending the car into the tree. I told myself she was already dying, that I was just sparing her more suffering. But the truth is, I was saving myself. The confession was devastating, but something felt wrong about his story. The evidence I'd seen pointed to years of systematic abuse, not a single moment of tragic accident. And my grandmother's recording had captured my mother's voice just hours before her death, terrified but very much alive and conscious. "Dad," I said carefully, "what about all the hospital visits? The documented injuries? The bruises in the photographs?" His expression shifted slightly, a flash of something calculating crossing his features. "Your mother was clumsy, Sarah. She fell downstairs, walked into doors. I tried to get her help, tried to convince her to be more careful, but she wouldn't listen. It was a lie." I could see it in his eyes, hear it in the way his voice changed. This wasn't a confession at all, it was just another manipulation, another carefully constructed story designed to make me believe a version of events that would minimize his guilt. He was still trying to control the narrative, even now. "I have the cassette tape, Dad," I said quietly. "The one where Mom talks about you strangling her, about you threatening to kill her if she left." I heard her voice, her fear. This wasn't an accident. The mask slipped then, completely and suddenly. The grieving widower, the remorseful man confessing to a moment of panic, disappeared. What remained was cold and dangerous, the predator my mother had been trying to escape. "Where did you find that tape?" he asked, his voice now completely different, calculating and sharp. The transformation in my father was terrifying. Gone was any pretense of remorse or grief. What sat across from me now was a predator whose carefully maintained facade had finally cracked. I realized with horrible clarity that this dinner wasn't about confession, it was about damage control. "Your grandmother was a bitter old woman who never liked me," he said, leaning forward slightly. "She filled Emma's head with poison, convinced her that normal marital disagreements were abuse. That tape, if it even exists, represents a woman's paranoid delusions, not reality." But I could see the calculation in his eyes, the same cold assessment that had helped him cover up a murder for 27 years. He was evaluating me as a threat, determining how much I knew and how dangerous I'd become to his carefully constructed life. "Dad, I've seen the medical records. The photographs. The pattern of escalating violence. Mom wasn't paranoid, she was documenting evidence because she knew you were going to kill her." He sat back, and for a moment I saw something that might have been admiration cross his features. "You're more thorough than I gave you credit for. More like your mother than I realized. She was always too smart for her own good too." The casual way he spoke about my mother's intelligence being a liability made my skin crawl. This wasn't grief or regret I was seeing, this was annoyance at being outmaneuvered. "The question now," he continued, "is what you plan to do with this information. Because we both know that going public with these accusations would destroy more than just me. It would destroy your memory of your childhood, your faith in everything you've ever believed about our family. It would make you the daughter of a murderer." He was trying to manipulate me, using my own emotional attachment to the father I thought I knew as a weapon against seeking justice for my mother. It was psychological warfare, designed to make me complicit in covering up his crime. "I already contacted a private investigator," I told him, watching his expression carefully. "I know you broke into his office, but I made backup copies of everything. The FBI is going to hear about this whether you like it or not." Something shifted in his posture, a subtle tensing that made every instinct scream danger. "That would be a mistake, Sarah. A very serious mistake." The threat was implicit but unmistakable. I was no longer his daughter in this moment. I was a problem to be solved, just like my mother had been. I excused myself to use the restroom, my heart hammering as I walked on unsteady legs to the back of the restaurant. Once inside, I pulled out my phone and called David Torres, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. David, I'm at the restaurant with him now. He's not confessing, he's threatening me. I think I'm in danger. Get out of there right now, David said urgently. Don't go back to the table. Leave through the kitchen exit if you have to. I'm calling the police. But it was too late. When I opened the restroom door, my father was standing right outside, waiting for me. The restaurant had grown quieter, fewer people around to witness whatever he was planning. We need to finish our conversation, he said, his hand gentle but firm on my elbow as he guided me toward the back exit. To anyone watching, it looked like a father helping his daughter, not a killer controlling his next victim. Dad, people know where I am. If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you, he interrupted, but his grip tightened. We're just going to take a drive, have a real conversation about what's best for everyone involved. We were in the parking lot now, the cool evening air doing nothing to calm my panic. His car was parked in a dark corner, away from the restaurant's windows. The same tactical thinking that had helped him stage my mother's death was being applied to me now. Get in the car, Sarah. I looked around frantically, hoping to see other people, but the parking lot was nearly empty. The dinner rush was over, and most customers had already gone home to their families. No one would witness whatever happened next. I won't get in the car, Dad. If you want to talk, we can do it right here. His patience finally snapped. You stupid girl. Do you have any idea what you've done? 30 years I've been a pillar of this community. 30 years of service, of respect, of building a life worth living. And you want to destroy all of that for what? For a woman who's been dead for decades? The venom in his voice when he spoke about my mother revealed the depth of his narcissism. Even now, he saw her not as a victim but as an inconvenience, a problem that had required solving. And now I was becoming the same kind of problem. She was my mother, I said, backing away from him. She deserved better than what you gave her. She deserved to live. She deserved exactly what she got, he snarled, abandoning all pretense now. She was going to take you away from me, destroy everything I'd worked for. I gave her every chance to be reasonable, to accept her place in our family, but she chose defiance instead. I turned and ran. I ran through that parking lot like my life depended on it, because it probably did. Behind me, I could hear my father's footsteps, steady and determined. He wasn't panicking the way I was. He was hunting, using the same methodical approach that had made him successful as a detective. My car was on the other side of the lot, too far to reach before he caught me. Instead, I ran toward the busy street, toward lights and people and witnesses. If he was going to kill me, he'd have to do it in front of half the town. Sarah, he called out, his voice now carrying the concerned tone of a worried father. To anyone else, it would look like a family emergency, not a chase. Sarah, wait. You forgot your purse. But I kept running, reaching the sidewalk just as David Torres pulled up in his car, followed by 2 police cruisers. The cavalry had arrived, but I could see the conflict on the officers' faces as they approached. These were men who'd worked alongside my father for years, who respected and trusted him. How do you arrest a colleague, a friend, based on the accusations of his allegedly unstable daughter? My father transformed instantly, becoming the concerned parent dealing with a daughter's mental health crisis. Officers, thank God you're here. Sarah's been having some kind of breakdown, making wild accusations, talking about 27-year-old conspiracy theories. I'm worried she might hurt herself. It was masterful manipulation, turning my accusations into symptoms of mental illness. Who would believe that Detective James Mitchell, pillar of the community, decorated officer with 3 decades of service, was actually a cold-blooded killer? Especially when the accuser was his own daughter, clearly distressed and making what sounded like paranoid claims about ancient history. David Torres stepped forward, producing a folder full of documents. Officers, I'm a licensed private investigator, and I have substantial evidence that Emma Mitchell was murdered by her husband in 1996. The case needs to be reopened immediately. But my father was still controlling the narrative. This man has been feeding my daughter's delusions, taking advantage of her grief over her grandmother's recent death. He's convinced her that her mother's tragic accident was somehow murder, despite the fact that I personally worked the case and found no evidence of foul play. I watched the officers' faces, seeing doubt creep in. My father's version sounded reasonable, plausible. A grieving daughter, manipulated by an opportunistic investigator, imagining sinister motives behind a simple tragedy. It was easier to believe than the truth that one of their own was a killer. I have evidence, I said desperately. Hospital records, photographs, a recorded confession from my mother. It's all in a safety deposit box downtown. My father's expression never changed, but I saw him calculating again, figuring out how to discredit whatever evidence I might produce. The next few hours felt like a surreal nightmare. We were all taken to the police station, where I found myself in the bizarre position of trying to convince my father's colleagues that he was a murderer. The evidence David and I had gathered was impressive, but my father's reputation and connections ran deep. Captain Reynolds, my father's longtime friend and current superior, reviewed the materials with obvious reluctance. The photographs of my mother's injuries were troubling, the hospital records concerning, but everything was decades old, open to interpretation. The cassette tape was the most damning evidence, but my father's lawyer argued that it was inadmissible, possibly fabricated, and certainly not enough to overcome the statute of limitations issues. Even if we accept these materials as genuine, the district attorney explained, proving murder after 27 years, when the original investigation concluded it was an accident, presents enormous challenges. We'd need new evidence, something that definitively proves criminal intent and contradicts the established facts. I felt my mother's killer slipping away again, using the same system he'd manipulated decades earlier to escape justice once more. But then David Torres produced something we hadn't expected, a witness. Margaret Walsh had been a rookie EMT in 1996, first on the scene of my mother's accident. She'd been too intimidated to speak up at the time, but David's investigation had tracked her down, and she was ready to tell the truth. The body positioning was all wrong, she testified. In a head-on collision like that, the victim should have been thrown forward, but Emma Mitchell's injuries suggested she'd been placed in that seat after death. The bruising on her neck was fresh, inconsistent with crash trauma. I tried to bring these concerns to the detective in charge, but he dismissed them. The detective in charge had been my father. Margaret's testimony provided the missing piece, professional medical opinion that my mother had been murdered and positioned to look like an accident victim. Combined with the evidence of long-term abuse and my mother's recorded fears, It painted a picture that even my father's connections couldn't erase. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source. During the investigation into David's burglary, police had recovered security footage from a neighboring business. The video clearly showed my father breaking into the private investigator's office, stealing the case files, and disposing of them in a dumpster across town. Suddenly, the grieving father trying to protect his unstable daughter narrative crumbled. Why would an innocent man destroy evidence unless he had something to hide? My father's mask finally slipped completely during his interrogation. Faced with overwhelming evidence and caught in multiple lies, he stopped pretending to be the victim of false accusations. The interrogation room was sterile and cold, nothing like the cozy restaurant where this nightmare had begun just hours earlier. Through the one-way glass, I watched my father face the truth for the first time in 27 years. Detective Martinez, brought in from another district to avoid conflicts of interest, laid out the evidence methodically. The medical examiner's report from 1996 noted inconsistencies that were never properly investigated, Martinez said, sliding photographs across the table. Your wife had defensive wounds on her hands, James. Skin cells under her fingernails that somehow never made it into evidence. Why do you think that happened? I could see my father's composure cracking. The man who'd controlled every aspect of this case for nearly 3 decades was finally being confronted by someone who couldn't be intimidated or manipulated. The cassette recording your mother-in-law made is particularly interesting, Martinez continued. Your wife specifically mentions you threatening to kill her if she tried to leave. She talks about previous strangulation attempts. That's very specific detail for someone who was allegedly delusional. But it was the insurance evidence that finally broke him. $250,000 policy, James. Taken out 6 months before Emma died. That's what we call premeditation. That's first-degree murder. My father sat silently for several minutes, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. Then he looked directly at the camera, knowing I was watching, and finally told the truth. She was going to destroy everything, he said, his voice flat and emotionless. 20 years on the force, reputation in the community, our family name. She was going to take Sarah and run, make me look like some kind of monster. I couldn't let that happen. The confession continued, each word hammering another nail into the coffin of the life he built on lies. He described months of planning, research into accident scenes, practice runs on the lonely stretch of Highway 9 where he'd eventually stage my mother's death. I followed her that night when she went to her mother's house. I knew she was planning to leave the next morning. It was my last chance to stop her, to make her see reason. But she wouldn't listen. She said she'd rather die than stay married to me. His voice never wavered as he described strangling my mother in his car, then driving to the staged accident site. I made it quick, he said, as if that somehow made the crime less heinous. She didn't suffer much. The casual way he discussed murdering my mother, as if she'd been an inconvenience rather than a human being, revealed the true depth of his narcissism. The trial that followed was a media circus. Decorated detective charged with wife's murder after 27 years dominated headlines for months. The prosecution, led by a team of experienced attorneys, methodically dismantled the lie my father had maintained for decades. I testified about discovering the evidence, about the years of wondering why my mother had died, about growing up believing my father was a hero when he was actually a killer. The hardest part was reading my mother's words from the cassette transcript, hearing her fear and desperation echoed in that courtroom. My father's defense team tried to paint him as a man who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of passion, not a calculated killer. They argued for manslaughter rather than murder, claiming the death was unplanned, that the staged accident was just panicked thinking after a tragic accident. But the evidence was overwhelming. The insurance policy proved premeditation. The pattern of abuse showed escalating violence. The professional staging of the crash scene demonstrated calculated planning, not panic. Most damning of all was his own confession, recorded and played for the jury in his own emotionless voice. The most difficult moment came when Margaret Walsh, the former EMT, testified about finding my mother's body. She described the unnatural positioning, the fresh bruising, the way my father had intimidated her into silence. "I knew something was wrong," she said through tears. "I should have spoken up. Maybe if I had, justice would have come sooner." My father showed no emotion throughout the trial. He sat stone-faced as witness after witness destroyed his carefully constructed narrative. Even when the jury returned with a guilty verdict on first-degree murder, he remained impassive, as if this were happening to someone else. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. "You spent 27 years living a lie," she said, staring down at the man who'd once sworn to serve and protect. "You used your position of trust to cover up one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, the murder of your own wife, the mother of your child. Justice may be delayed, but it has finally arrived." As they led him away in handcuffs, he looked at me one final time. There was no apology in his eyes, no remorse, just the cold calculation of a predator who'd finally been caged. In that moment, I realized that the father I'd loved had never really existed. He'd been just another one of James Mitchell's carefully constructed lies. The aftermath of the trial left me emotionally devastated but finally free to grieve properly for the mother I'd never really known. I visited her grave for the first time since learning the truth, bringing flowers and the words I should have been able to say to her face. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find the truth," I whispered to her headstone. "I'm sorry I believed his lies for so many years. But I finally got justice for you, Mom. He'll never hurt anyone else." Mark had stood by me throughout the ordeal, helping me process the trauma of discovering that my entire childhood had been built on a foundation of murder and deception. We started counseling together, working through the complex emotions of loving someone who turned out to be a monster, of grieving for the father I'd thought I knew while celebrating the conviction of the killer he actually was. The hardest part was dealing with the extended family's reactions. Some relatives couldn't accept that the James Mitchell they'd known for decades was capable of such brutality. They accused me of destroying a good man's reputation based on flimsy evidence and ancient grudges. Others, particularly my mother's side of the family, thanked me for finally giving Emma the justice she deserved. My grandmother Rose's funeral had happened during the trial, and I'd been too consumed with legal proceedings to properly say goodbye. But now I understood that her final gift to me wasn't just the truth about my mother's death, it was the strength to seek justice no matter how painful the process became. I started a foundation in my mother's name, dedicated to helping domestic violence victims find safety and support. Too many women were trapped in abusive relationships, afraid to speak up because their abusers had power, connections, or authority. Emma's voice would make sure their stories were heard and believed. The foundation's first case involved a police officer's wife who'd been documenting abuse for months but was too terrified to report it. Her husband's colleagues protected him, just like my father's had protected him decades earlier. But this time, we had resources, legal support, and the determination to break through the blue wall of silence. Within a year, Emma's voice had helped dozens of women escape dangerous situations, providing them with legal representation, safe housing, and the counseling they needed to rebuild their lives. It felt like the best way to honor my mother's memory to ensure that her death hadn't been completely meaningless. 3 years have passed since I found that letter in my grandmother's attic, and I'm finally learning to live with the truth about my family. The nightmares have mostly stopped, though I still sometimes wake up thinking about what my life might have been like if my mother had survived, if she'd been able to take me away from the monster who raised me. Mark and I had a daughter last year, Emma Rose, named for the two women who'd shaped my understanding of courage and sacrifice. Holding my daughter in my arms, I think about the mother I never really knew, about the woman who died trying to protect me from the truth I eventually had to face anyway. My father writes to me from prison sometimes, letters I never open. His lawyer says he wants to explain his side of the story, to help me understand why he did what he did. But there's nothing he could say that would change the fundamental truth. He murdered my mother and spent 27 years lying about it. No explanation can erase that reality. Sometimes people ask me if I regret investigating my mother's death, if I wish I'd left the past buried and continued living in ignorance. The answer is always no. My mother deserved better than to be forgotten, to have her murder covered up and dismissed as a tragic accident. She deserved justice, even if it came decades too late. Emma's voice has grown beyond anything I imagined, helping hundreds of domestic violence survivors find safety and legal support. We've trained law enforcement agencies on recognizing patterns of abuse, on investigating cases more thoroughly when the perpetrator has authority or connections. We've changed laws, saved lives, and made sure that other women don't have to die in silence the way my mother did. The secret they buried was supposed to stay hidden forever, protected by lies and institutional corruption. But truth has a way of surfacing eventually, no matter how deep you try to bury it. My grandmother knew that when she saved that evidence, when she wrote that letter explaining everything she couldn't say while my father was alive and dangerous. I think about my mother often now, not just the idealized memory of a woman who died too young, but the real Emma Mitchell who fought to protect her daughter, who documented her abuse, who planned her escape even though she knew the risks. She was braver than I ever realized, stronger than the scared 5-year-old who missed her could have understood. The truth was painful, devastating, life-changing. But it was also liberating. For the first time in my life, I know who I really am, the daughter of a victim who became a survivor, raised by a killer who could never destroy the love and strength my real mother gave me. That's a legacy worth fighting for, worth living for, worth passing on to the next generation. The secret they buried has finally been unearthed, and with it came justice, healing, and the chance to honor my mother's memory properly. Some truths are worth waiting for, no matter how long they take to surface.